Picture this. What if two of history's greatest political philosophers could sit down together, not in some sterile academic setting, but in a dimly lit pub where ideas flow as freely as the ale? What would happen when the man who believed government was humanity's salvation met the thinker who questioned whether we needed saving at all? The old tavern creaks under the weight of centuries of conversation. Smoke from countless pipes has stained the wooden beams dark brown, and the flickering candlelight casts dancing shadows across worn tables, scarred by decades of heated debates. In a corner booth, away from the main crowd, two figures lean forward in intense discussion. Their voices carry the weight of ideas that have shaped nations and toppled kings. Thomas Hobbes adjusts his spectacles, his weathered face creased with the lines of a man who has witnessed civil war firsthand. Across from him sits David Hume, younger by several decades, his Scottish accent lending a musical quality to his measured words. Between them, pewter mugs sit forgotten as their minds grapple with questions that have haunted humanity since the first government was formed. "You know, David," Hobbes begins, his voice carrying the gravity of lived experience, "I've seen what men do to each other when there's no authority to stop them. I lived through the English Civil War. I watched neighbors turn into enemies, watched civilization crumble into chaos." He pauses, taking a slow sip from his mug. "Without the state, without that great leviathan to keep us in line, we're nothing but beasts tearing each other apart." Hume's eyebrows raise slightly, a subtle smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Ah, Thomas, but that's where you and I part ways. You speak of the state as if it's some divine necessity, but have you considered that perhaps it's not the absence of government that makes men cruel, but the very concentration of power that creates the monsters we fear? The tension in the air is palpable. These aren't just abstract philosophical musings. These are ideas that have justified revolutions and sustained empires. The very foundations of political authority hang in the balance of their words." Hobbes leans back, his eyes never leaving Hume's face. "You Scots and your skepticism," he says with a wry chuckle. "But tell me this, if not the state, what keeps a man from taking what he wants from his weaker neighbor? What stops the strong from enslaving the weak? In the state of nature, before any government exists, what do you have but the war of all against all?" "Now that's an interesting assumption," Hume replies, leaning forward with renewed interest. "You assume that without government men naturally become wolves. But what if our nature is more complicated than that? What if we're neither angels nor demons, but something far more interesting, creatures capable of both cooperation and conflict, depending on the circumstances?" The debate that unfolds between these two intellectual giants isn't just academic exercise. Their ideas have shaped democracies and dictatorships, justified both revolution and submission to authority. Hobbes, the philosopher who witnessed his country tear itself apart, arguing for the absolute necessity of strong government. Hume, the skeptical Scotsman, questioning whether the cure might sometimes be worse than the disease. As the evening deepens and the tavern grows quieter, their conversation becomes more intimate, more personal. These aren't just philosophers debating abstract concepts. They're men who have grappled with the fundamental questions of human existence. What do we owe each other? What do we owe to authority? Can power ever be trusted, or is it always corrupting? "The thing is, Thomas," Hume says, tracing patterns on the wooden table with his finger, "you've built your entire philosophy on fear. Fear of chaos, fear of violence, fear of our own nature. But what if that fear is clouding your judgment? What if the very institutions you think protect us are the ones creating the conditions you're so afraid of?" Hobbes's response comes with the weight of personal experience behind it. "Fear? You call it fear, but I call it wisdom earned through suffering. I've seen what happens when the bonds of society dissolve. I've watched good men become monsters when there's no law to restrain them. The state isn't perfect, David, but it's the only thing standing between us and the abyss." The fundamental disagreement is becoming clear, and it cuts to the heart of political philosophy itself. Is government a necessary evil that saves us from our worst impulses? Or is it a potentially beneficial institution that can enhance human flourishing when properly designed? The answer isn't just philosophical, it's practical, affecting how we structure our societies and how we relate to power. The candlelight flickers as Hobbes shifts in his seat, the wooden chair creaking under his weight. His eyes take on the distant look of a man revisiting painful memories, but his voice remains steady and resolute. "Let me tell you what I witnessed, David, because philosophy without experience is just pretty words floating in the air." Hobbes's weathered hands wrap around his mug, knuckles white with the intensity of his grip. Imagine waking up one morning to find that everything you thought was certain has crumbled overnight. The king's authority questioned, parliament in revolt, neighbor fighting neighbor in the streets. He pauses, letting the weight of his words settle between them. That's what I lived through. The English Civil War wasn't some abstract political theory. It was blood in the gutters, families destroyed, commerce ground to a halt, and all because men decided they could live without proper authority. Hume listens intently, but his expression remains skeptical. But surely, Thomas, you can't blame all of humanity's ills on the absence of government. What about the wars fought by governments? What about the oppression carried out in the name of law and order? Ah, but you miss the point entirely. Hobbes responds with sudden energy, leaning forward across the small table. Yes, governments can be cruel, even tyrannical, but even the worst government is preferable to no government at all. You see, in the state of nature, before any social contract, before any authority, life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. The philosopher's voice drops to almost a whisper, but the intensity only increases. Without the state, there is no justice, because there's no one to define what's just. There's no property, because there's no one to protect it. There's no industry, because why plant a crop if your neighbor can simply take it? There's no art, no learning, no comfort, nothing but the constant fear of violent death. Hume raises his hand slightly, a gesture both respectful and challenging. But Thomas, you're painting human nature with an awfully dark brush. Are we really such creatures that we can only be held in check by the sword? What about our capacity for sympathy, for cooperation, for mutual aid? Hobbes shakes his head vigorously. Sympathy, cooperation? These are luxuries, David. Luxuries that only exist when we feel secure. Strip away that security, remove the protection of law, and watch how quickly your sympathetic neighbors become your deadly enemies. I'm not saying men are evil by nature. I'm saying they're rational, and rational creatures will do whatever it takes to survive. The older philosopher stands and begins pacing the small space beside their table, his movements deliberate and measured. Consider this carefully. In the state of nature, every man has a right to everything, even to one another's body. If I think you might threaten me tomorrow, I have not just the right but the rational obligation to kill you today. It's not cruelty, it's self-preservation. And this is why, Hobbes continues, turning back to face Hume directly, we must create that great Leviathan, that artificial man we call the state. We must give up our natural rights, all of them, to a sovereign authority. Only then can we have peace, only then can we have civilization. Hume's brow furrows as he considers this argument. But surely you see the problem with absolute sovereignty. If we give all our rights to the state, what protection do we have from the state itself? You're asking us to escape the theoretical wolves by climbing into the jaws of a very real lion. Better the lion we can see than the wolves we cannot count, Hobbes replies without hesitation. The sovereign, whether a monarch, an assembly, or whatever form it takes, has every incentive to keep the peace. A ruler of corpses rules over nothing. But in the state of nature, every man is his own sovereign, and the result is chaos. The fire in the tavern's hearth pops and crackles, sending new shadows dancing across the walls. Other patrons have long since departed, leaving the two philosophers in their intellectual combat, surrounded by the ghosts of empty chairs and abandoned conversations. You speak of incentives, Hume says thoughtfully, but what about the incentive for power to corrupt? What about the tendency of authority to expand beyond its original purpose? You're asking us to trust absolutely in the goodwill of those who hold absolute power. Hobbes pauses his pacing, considering the question seriously. I'm not asking you to trust in anyone's goodwill, David. I'm asking you to recognize necessity. The sovereign may abuse power, undoubtedly will to some degree, but the alternative isn't freedom. It's the war of all against all. It's the strong preying on the weak with no recourse, no appeal, no hope of justice. And besides, he continues, settling back into his chair, even if the sovereign is unjust, at least there's only one source of injustice instead of thousands. At least there's predictability, some hope of order. In anarchy, every man is judge, jury, and executioner in his own cause. That's not freedom, that's hell on earth. The weight of Hobbes's argument hangs heavy in the tavern air. This isn't just political theory. It's a diagnosis of the human condition itself, a prescription written in the blood of civil war and the ashes of failed states. But across the table, Hume's eyes gleam with the light of someone who sees flaws in even the most compelling argument. Hume takes a long, deliberate sip from his mug, his eyes never leaving Hobbes's face. When he sets it down, There's a soft smile playing at his lips, not mocking but genuinely thoughtful, as if he's about to share a secret that might change everything. Thomas, my friend, you've painted quite the picture. Humanity as a collection of rational beasts, salvation through absolute submission to power. It's compelling, I'll give you that, but I think you've made a fundamental error, one that undermines your entire philosophical edifice. The Scotsman leans back in his chair, his posture relaxed but his mind clearly engaged. You assume that human nature is fixed, that we're always and everywhere the same selfish, fearful creatures, but what if that's not true? What if our nature is far more adaptable, far more influenced by circumstances than you imagine? Hobbes narrows his eyes, intrigued despite himself. Go on. Well, consider this, Hume begins, his Scottish accent adding a musical quality to his words. You lived through a civil war, a time when society had indeed broken down, but that wasn't the state of nature. That was the collapse of an existing order. The violence you witnessed wasn't proof of our natural condition, but evidence of what happens when established expectations are suddenly overturned. He pauses, letting this distinction sink in. You see the difference? In a true state of nature, if such a thing ever existed, people wouldn't have the same expectations, the same sense of betrayal and injustice that fuels the violence of civil war. They'd develop different customs, different ways of resolving conflicts. Hobbes shifts uncomfortably. But surely you're not suggesting that without government people would simply cooperate? Not exactly, Hume replies with a chuckle. I'm far too skeptical for such optimism, but I am suggesting that the choice isn't binary. It's not between your Leviathan and complete chaos. There are degrees of organization, forms of authority, that don't require absolute submission. The younger philosopher begins to warm to his theme, his hands moving expressively as he speaks. Think about it, Thomas. Even in your own argument, you acknowledge that governments can be tyrannical. But if that's true, then the state isn't solving the problem of human selfishness. It's simply concentrating it in the hands of a few. At least it's concentrated, Hobbes interjects. At least there's order. But what kind of order? Hume counters. You speak as if any order is better than no order, but surely that can't be right. What about the order of slavery? The order of the torture chamber? The order of systematic oppression? Are these really preferable to the messiness of freedom? The fire in the hearth has burned lower now, casting longer shadows across their faces. The intensity of their debate seems to have drawn all the warmth from the room, leaving only the cold logic of competing ideas. Hume continues, his voice taking on a more personal tone. I think the real issue, Thomas, is that you've conflated two very different things: legitimate authority and mere power. A government can demand obedience through force, but that doesn't make it legitimate. True political authority comes from consent, from the recognition that those in power serve the common good. Consent? Hobbes almost laughs. David, you're living in a fantasy. Show me one government in history that truly rules by consent. Even in your precious democracies, the majority forces its will on the minority. That's not consent. That's simply a more palatable form of coercion. Perhaps, Hume acknowledges, but that's exactly my point. If all government is ultimately based on force, then we need to be very careful about how much force we're willing to accept. Your Leviathan demands everything: our rights, our freedoms, our very ability to resist. That's not a solution to tyranny, that's tyranny perfected. The Scottish philosopher leans forward, his eyes intense with conviction. Here's what I think you're missing. Human beings are neither angels nor demons, but something far more interesting. We're creatures of habit and custom, capable of both selfishness and sympathy. We don't need absolute authority to live together peacefully, but we do need institutions that work with our nature rather than against it. And what would such institutions look like? Hobbes asks, genuine curiosity in his voice despite his skepticism. Limited government, Hume replies without hesitation. Authority that's accountable, that can be questioned and changed. Laws that apply equally to rulers and ruled. Power that's divided rather than concentrated, so that no one person or group can become your Leviathan. Hobbes shakes his head slowly. You're describing a recipe for paralysis, David. Divided authority is no authority at all. When crisis comes, and it always comes, who decides, who acts? Your limited government will spend so much time checking and balancing itself that society will collapse while the committees debate. Better that than surrendering our humanity to avoid the possibility of conflict, Hume shoots back. You're so afraid of disorder that you're willing to embrace any form of order, no matter how crushing. But some things are worse than chaos, and absolute submission to unlimited power is one of them. The two men stare at each other across the small table, the fundamental disagreement now fully exposed. It's not just about political systems. It's about human nature itself, about what we are capable of and what we deserve. Tell me honestly, Thomas, Hume says quietly, in your heart of hearts, do you really believe that people are incapable of governing themselves? That we're so fundamentally flawed that we need to surrender everything to avoid destroying each other? The question hangs in the air like smoke, waiting for an answer that might bridge the chasm between their worldviews or prove that some philosophical divides are unbridgeable. Hobbes stares into the dying flames of the hearth, his weathered face a mask of contemplation. When he finally speaks, his voice carries a weight that seems to press down on the very air between them. You ask me what I truly believe about human nature, David. Let me tell you a story. He turns back to face Hume, his eyes reflecting decades of accumulated wisdom and pain. When I was a young man, I knew a merchant, good fellow, honest in his dealings, kind to his family. During the early days of the war, when order began to break down, I watched him change. The old philosopher's voice drops to barely above a whisper. First, he started carrying a sword, just for protection, he said. Then he began refusing credit to customers he'd trusted for years. Couldn't risk it, he explained. By the end, he was leading a group of armed men, taking what they needed from those too weak to resist. Not out of malice, mind you, but out of necessity. Hobbes pauses, his hands clasping and unclasping on the table. That's what you don't understand about human nature, David. We're not inherently evil, but we're inherently fearful, and fear makes monsters of us all. Hume listens with genuine attention, but his expression remains unconvinced. I don't doubt your merchant's story, Thomas, but consider this. The situation you describe isn't the state of nature. It's the breakdown of an existing order. Your merchant had lived his entire life expecting certain protections, certain rules. When those disappeared, of course, he was terrified. The Scotsman leans forward, his voice gaining strength. But imagine if that merchant had grown up in a different system entirely, one where he'd learned to cooperate with his neighbors, not out of fear of punishment, but out of mutual benefit, where he'd developed customs and habits of peaceful resolution. Would he have become the same kind of monster? You're describing a fairy tale, Hobbes responds, but there's less certainty in his voice now. Some perfect society that's never existed and never will exist. Am I? Hume challenges. What about Scotland, Thomas? What about the Highland clans? They have no central authority in the way you describe, yet they've developed complex systems of honor, obligation, and mutual support. They settle disputes. They cooperate in times of crisis. They maintain order, all without your Leviathan. Hobbes waves a dismissive hand. The Scots also raid each other's cattle and wage blood feuds that last for generations. That's hardly the peaceful cooperation you're describing. True enough, Hume concedes with a slight smile. But they also have poetry, music, art, trade, love, friendship, all the things you claim are impossible without absolute authority. Their violence is ritualized, limited, governed by custom. It's not the war of all against all. The debate has taken on a more personal tone now, each man drawing on his own cultural experience to support his arguments. The English philosopher who witnessed civil war, and the Scottish thinker who grew up seeing alternative forms of social organization. But here's what truly troubles me about your position, Hume continues, his voice taking on an edge of passion. You're asking people to make a bargain with the devil. You're saying, give up your freedom, your dignity, your right to resist, and in return, we'll give you order. But what happens when that order becomes oppressive? What happens when your Leviathan decides that maintaining peace requires crushing dissent? Hobbes straightens in his chair, his own passion rising to match Hume's. And what happens when your limited government faces a real crisis? When enemy armies march across the border? When plague threatens the population? When economic collapse looms? Your committees and checks and balances will debate while Rome burns. Perhaps, Hume admits, but at least we'll burn as free men rather than live as slaves. And more importantly, we'll have the possibility of learning from our mistakes, of adapting, of growing. Your system offers no such hope, only eternal submission to whoever happens to hold power. The two philosophers stare at each other across an intellectual chasm that seems to grow wider with each exchange. Their fundamental disagreement isn't just about politics, it's about human potential, about whether people are capable of growth and self-governance, or whether they're condemned to eternal fear and submission. You know what I think the real difference is between us? Hume says after a long moment of silence. You've lost faith in humanity. You've seen us at our worst and concluded that's all we're capable of. But I've seen us at our best. and I believe that's just as real, just as true to our nature. Hobbes considers this accusation carefully. Perhaps you're right about my lack of faith. But tell me this, David. Isn't it better to prepare for the worst and be pleasantly surprised than to hope for the best and watch civilization collapse around you? That depends, Hume replies thoughtfully, on whether your preparation for the worst actually makes the worst more likely to happen. If you create a system based on the assumption that people are selfish and fearful, don't you think you might create conditions that make them more selfish and fearful? The question strikes at the heart of their disagreement, exposing the circularity that might lie at the center of all political philosophy. Do institutions shape human nature? Or does human nature determine what institutions are possible? The answer might determine not just the fate of governments, but the future of human civilization itself. The tavern has grown cold now, the fire reduced to glowing embers that cast an eerie red light across the two philosophers' faces. Outside, the wind has picked up, rattling the windows and sending ghostly whispers through the cracks in the old building. It's as if nature itself is reflecting the tension that crackles between these two brilliant minds. Hobbes breaks the silence first, his voice carrying the weight of finality. David, I fear we've reached the heart of our disagreement, and it's deeper than mere politics. We're talking about the very essence of what it means to be human. He stands and moves to the window, staring out into the darkness beyond. You see potential for growth, for moral development, for some kind of gradual improvement in the human condition. But I've lived longer than you, my friend. I've seen empires rise and fall, watched good intentions pave roads to hell, witnessed the same follies repeated generation after generation. Turning back to face Hume, his silhouette framed against the dark glass, Hobbes continues, "We are what we are, David. Creatures driven by passion and fear, capable of reason but more often ruled by appetite. To build a philosophy of government on the hope that we might somehow transcend our nature is to build on quicksand." Hume shakes his head slowly, a sad smile playing across his features. "And there's where you're wrong, Thomas. You think I'm some starry-eyed optimist, but I'm not. I'm every bit as skeptical as you are, perhaps more so. The difference is that I'm skeptical of power as well as people." The Scottish philosopher rises from his chair and begins pacing, his movements restless and energetic despite the late hour. "You've correctly identified the problem. Human beings are indeed driven by passion, capable of both cooperation and conflict. But your solution, absolute submission to authority, doesn't solve the problem. It just gives those same flawed human beings unlimited power over everyone else. At least it's predictable power," Hobbes interjects. "At least there are rules, even if they're harsh ones." "But whose rules?" Hume demands, spinning to face his opponent. "And enforced by whom? You speak of the sovereign as if it's some abstract entity, but it's not. It's made up of people. The same flawed, passionate, fearful people you claim need absolute control. What makes them different? What makes them worthy of the total trust you deny to everyone else?" The accusation hangs in the air like an indictment. Hobbes opens his mouth to respond, then closes it, his usual quick retort nowhere to be found. Hume presses his advantage. "This is the fundamental contradiction in your system, Thomas. You say people can't be trusted to govern themselves because they're selfish and irrational. But then you say they can be trusted to choose their absolute rulers, and that those rulers can be trusted with unlimited power. It makes no sense." "It makes perfect sense," Hobbes finally responds, but his voice lacks its earlier certainty. "The sovereign has every incentive to maintain order and prosperity. A ruler of chaos rules over nothing. Unless," Hume counters, "the ruler's personal interests conflict with the common good. Unless maintaining power requires oppression rather than prosperity. Unless the sovereign decides that some subjects are expendable for the greater good, or more likely for the sovereign's good." The two men face each other across the small room, their intellectual battle reaching its climax. Years of thought, decades of experience, entire worldviews hang in the balance of their words. "You want to know what I really think?" Hume says, his voice dropping to an intense whisper. "I think your Leviathan is worse than useless. It's actively harmful. By concentrating power in the hands of the few, you've taken all the problems of human nature and magnified them 1,000-fold. Instead of many small conflicts that can be resolved locally, you've created the possibility of massive, systematic oppression." Hobbes straightens, his own voice rising in response. "And your alternative leads to Somalia, to failed states where warlords battle over scraps while the innocent suffer. At least under my system, there's the possibility of peace even if it comes at the cost of freedom. But what's peace without dignity?" Hume shoots back. What's order without justice? You're offering people the peace of the grave, the order of the prison cell. That's not civilization, it's death by another name. The fundamental divide between them is now fully exposed. It's not just about forms of government or political theory. It's about competing visions of human worth and potential. Hobbes sees creatures so flawed that they must surrender their autonomy to survive. Hume sees beings capable of growth and cooperation if given the right conditions and institutions. Perhaps, Hobbes says quietly, his anger spent. We've been arguing past each other this entire evening. Perhaps the real question isn't whether the state is good or evil, but what kind of state serves human flourishing. Hume pauses in his pacing, struck by this unexpected concession. Go on. Maybe you're right that absolute power corrupts absolutely. And maybe I'm right that no power at all leads to chaos. Could it be that the answer lies somewhere between our positions? For the first time in hours, both men seem to step back from the brink of their disagreement, looking for common ground in the vast wasteland of their philosophical differences. The question is whether such ground exists, or whether some divisions are simply too fundamental to bridge. The embers in the fireplace have nearly died out, leaving the tavern in near darkness, save for the single candle that continues to flicker between the two philosophers. The late hour has brought with it a different quality to their conversation, less combative, more reflective, as if the intensity of their debate has burned away everything but the essential truths they're both seeking. Hume settles back into his chair, his expression thoughtful rather than argumentative. You know, Thomas, there's something we haven't discussed in all our passionate disagreement. We've been talking as if government is either wholly good or wholly evil, but what if we've been asking the wrong question entirely? Hobbes raises an eyebrow, intrigued despite himself. What do you mean? Well, consider this, Hume begins, his voice taking on the measured tone of someone working through a complex problem in real time. Maybe the question isn't whether we need government, but what kind of government we need for different circumstances, different times, different peoples. The older philosopher leans forward, genuinely curious now. Go on. Your experience of civil war, your fear of chaos, these aren't unreasonable responses to real threats. In times of genuine crisis, when society truly is breaking down, perhaps stronger authority is necessary. But does that mean we need to structure all our institutions around the assumption of permanent crisis? Hume pauses, searching Hobbes's face for understanding. Similarly, my arguments for limited government, for individual freedom, these make sense in stable societies where people have developed customs and institutions that support cooperation, but they might be disasters in circumstances where such foundations don't exist. Hobbes considers this carefully, his fingers drumming slowly on the wooden table. You're suggesting that political authority isn't one size fits all? Exactly. Hume nods with growing enthusiasm. Think about it. The government needed by a small farming village is different from what's needed by a great commercial city. The authority required during wartime is different from what's appropriate during peace. The institutions that work for an educated population might fail completely with an illiterate one. For the first time all evening, Hobbes smiles, not sarcastically but with genuine warmth. That's actually quite sensible. I've been so focused on the universal need for order that I haven't considered how that order might take different forms. And I, Hume admits, have been so concerned with preventing tyranny that I haven't fully acknowledged the genuine need for authority in certain circumstances. Perhaps we've both been guilty of trying to solve all problems with our preferred solutions. The conversation has taken on a different quality now. Less debate, more collaboration. Two brilliant minds working together rather than against each other, seeking truth rather than victory. But this raises new questions, Hobbes points out. If different circumstances require different forms of government, who decides what's appropriate? And how do we prevent rulers from claiming extraordinary powers by manufacturing crises? Those are excellent questions, Hume acknowledges. And I think they point to something important, the need for what we might call adaptive institutions. Government structures that can respond to changing circumstances without losing their fundamental accountability to the people they serve. Hobbes nods slowly. Like emergency powers that automatically expire after a set time? Or institutions that can expand their authority during genuine crises, but have built-in mechanisms that force them to contract again when the crisis passes. Precisely, Hume says with excitement. You see, Thomas, we've been thinking about this as if we have to choose between your Leviathan and complete anarchy. But what if we could design institutions that are strong enough to maintain order when necessary, but limited enough to preserve freedom when possible? The two philosophers look at each other across the table, and for a moment, the decades of difference between them seem to dissolve. They're not opponents anymore, but collaborators in the ancient human project of trying to figure out how to live together peacefully and prosperously. Of course, Hobbes says with a chuckle, designing such institutions is one thing. Making them work in practice is quite another. We'd need rulers wise enough to recognize when circumstances truly require expanded powers, and virtuous enough to give up those powers when they're no longer needed. True, Hume agrees, but perhaps that's where my faith in human nature isn't entirely naive. People are capable of both selfishness and virtue. The key is creating institutions that encourage the virtue while constraining the selfishness. Hobbes considers this. Checks and balances, you mean? Not just limits on power, but incentives for its proper use. Among other things, yes, but also what we might call civic education, helping people understand not just their rights but their responsibilities, teaching them to be active participants in governance rather than passive subjects. The candle between them flickers one last time and goes out, leaving them in the red glow of the dying embers, but neither man moves to relight it. The darkness seems appropriate somehow, as if they're feeling their way toward truths that can't be fully illuminated by any single flame. Perhaps, Hobbes says quietly, the real lesson is that governance is an ongoing experiment, not a problem to be solved once and for all. Every generation has to figure out anew how to balance order and freedom, authority and liberty. And perhaps, Hume adds, that's not a failure of political philosophy, but its greatest insight. The recognition that human beings and human societies are too complex, too varied, too dynamic for any single system to capture permanently. As the first hints of dawn begin to creep through the tavern windows, two of history's greatest political thinkers sit in comfortable silence, no longer adversaries but fellow travelers on the long road toward understanding. Their fundamental disagreements remain, but they've found something perhaps more valuable, a recognition that the questions they're grappling with are bigger than any one answer, more important than any single solution. The state may be neither pure evil nor perfect good, but something more interesting and more challenging, a tool that, like fire, can warm homes or burn them down, depending on how wisely it's controlled and how carefully it's tended. The real work isn't choosing between order and freedom, but learning how to preserve both in an ever-changing world. As they finally rise to leave, shaking hands in the grey morning light, both men know their conversation will continue, if not between them, then in the minds of everyone who grapples with the eternal questions of political life. How much authority do we need? How much freedom can we afford? And how do we tell the difference between the government we deserve and the government we fear? The answers, like the dawn breaking outside, are always just beginning to emerge.